Hi, and welcome to our third and final type of calculation we'll have to do for nutrition, and that's calculating feeding amounts. So often what happens in the vet clinic is the doctor makes a diet prescription for an animal that needs to switch over to a new food. And they say, hey, VOA, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love for you to calculate the feeding amounts for this animal. So I have a scenario for you here to show you an example. So the scenario is a cat needs to be switched to a diabetic diet, and the vet wants you to figure out how much the cat needs to be fed per day of a dry and wet diet. The dry food is 347 kilocalories per cup. The canned food is 181 kilocalories per can. So we have two options here for how the vet or the client might present how they'd like you to figure out the food. So in scenario A, the owner has an idea about how much canned food they'd like to feed their animal. And this is, I find, the more common method. So this owner already feeds a half of a can of Friskies, let's say, per day. So they have no problem switching that to be a half of a can of the diabetic diet. So they want to feed a half a can per day, which means that the remaining amount of the cat's caloric intake is going to come from dry food. And then in this scenario, the cat requires 250 kilocalories per day. Our other option is that the vet has an idea about how much food they'd like how much of the food they'd like to come from the canned food. So in this case, the vet has asked you to figure out feeding amounts if the cat gets half of their caloric intake from canned food. And again, caloric intake is 250 kilocalories per day. So we have two different types of scenarios here. So I'll show you the steps for the first one. The first scenario first. So the owner wants to feed half of a can per day. So again, if you revisit your formula sheets, I have the instructions on how to calculate feeding amounts if the feeding amount of canned food is given. So in this case, it is given. It is a half of a can per day. So our first step is we need to figure out how many kilocalories per day.
Charlie's on the set.
Okay. We need to figure out how many kilocalories per day is being taken up by the canned food. Okay. So how many cans per day are we going to feed? The answer is half. So again, remember, if you don't know your fractions, 1 divided by 2 is 0.5. So I'm going to put step 1. So the cans per day is 0.5 cans per day. And then we need to multiply that by how many kilocalories are in a can. Okay? So the amount of kilocalories in a canned food is 181 kilocalories per can. So this is going to give us, 181 times 0.5 is 90.5 kilocalories per day. And this is of canned food. So we can figure out our units by canceling out the cans, so we're left with kilocalories per day. So 90.5 kilocalories per day is taken up by canned food. So next, then, we need to figure out how much kilocalories we have left for our dry food. So step 2. We are going to take how many kilocalories per day we have total for this cat. So the total amount we have is 250 kilocalories per day. So that's the total. And then we can subtract that from that the amount used up by the canned food. So the cat is eating half of a can of canned food, which is worth 90.5 kilocalories per day. And that's going to give us, so 250 minus 90.5 is 159.5 kilocalories per day, and that is going to be for dry food then. So this was our total. This is canned, and this is dry. Okay, so we have 159 kilocalories per day to use for dry food now. And then our last step is step 3, and that's calculate the feeding amounts. So I'm just going to jump down here for calculating the feeding amounts of dry food. So that's step 3. I just want to make sure I'm still on the sheet here. Yes, okay. So kilocalories per day of canned food. So, whoops, sorry, that's supposed to say cups, I think. Kilocalories per day of dry. I really got to edit this sheet. Divided by how many kilocalories per cup, and then we end up with how many cups per day. So how many kilocalories per day of dry do we have? Well, that's what we just calculated in step 2. So we have 159.5 kilocalories per day, and this is dry. And we're going to divide that by the kilocalories per cup. So we can get that information back in our question. There's 347 kilocalories per cup. And so 159.5 divided by 347 is 0.4596541. So we're going to need to do some rounding here. If we look here, it's like 0.45. We could look to the 9 and round that up to 0.46. So 0.46 is not really a feeding amount. So can you tell an owner to go ahead and measure 0.46 of a cup of food? You cannot. So what you're going to need to do is give them an actual feeding amount. So the actual feeding amount here, 0.46, is really close to 0.45, which is half of a cup. So half of a cup per day would be a more reasonable feeding amount. So then you would say feed, so this is your instructions to the owner, feed a half of a can per day plus a half of a cup dry per day. Okay, so that would be our answer. That's the answer that we would give for this question, is half of a can per day plus half of a cup dry per day. So in case you don't, hold on, I think I just have a list written down of common, like decimal points. So if you have 0.25, that's a quarter cup. If you have 0.33, that's a third of a cup. 0.5 would be a half of a cup. 0.67 is 2/3. 0.75 is 3/4. Okay, these are the main ones I would stick to, because can you really ask an owner to measure like 1/8 of a cup or 1/5 of a cup or 3/5 of a cup? It's just not a reasonable measure for them to be able to do. Most people have measuring spoons that have, or measuring cups that have these increments. So that's why I would stick with only these ones. So if you have like 0.28, then I would call it a quarter of a cup. If I had like 0.36, I would call it a third of a cup. 0.42, I would probably make it a half. It's gonna depend though if you're in like a middle zone, so right in between. So let's say I have 0.71. That's right in between 2/3 and 3/4. So how do I decide? I'm gonna look at the cat or the dog and look at their overall body condition. So if their body condition is indicating more on the overweight side, I'm gonna opt for the lower feeding amount. If they are on the underweight side, I'm gonna opt for the higher feeding amount. Feeding amount calculations are all well and good, but ultimately what we need to rely on is how the animal's reacting to the food. So what we typically do is have animals come in for a weight check after like 2 weeks. If they're gaining weight pretty quickly, we can scale that food back a little bit. If they're like losing weight, God forbid, or if they're supposed to be gaining and they're not, we can scale it up a little bit. So these feeding amounts kind of give us a starting point, and they're usually a pretty accurate starting point. But that being said, we can change the feeding amounts a little bit based on what the animal's appearance is. In this case, it was pretty cut and dry. I feel like 0.46 is really close to that 0.5, so I just went ahead and called it a half of a cup. I'm pretty sure in most of the exercises, I make it clear what it should be, like where I would round to. If you do have any questions about that, by all means, ask, and we can discuss it a little bit further. But that's basically what I'm talking about when I'm saying to like round to a feedable amount, okay? So these are feedable amounts. People can measure these, but like good luck asking someone to measure like 1/7 of a cup. Okay, so that's our nutrition math then for calculating a scenario where we know how much canned food we want the owner to feed. Sometimes though, like I said, the doctor gives us, like they want half the caloric intake to come from canned food, or they want 3/4 to come from canned food. So in that case, we need to do the calculation a little bit differently. So we're gonna look at our formula sheet, and we can look if the percentage of canned food is given. So if the doctor has said, I want 50% to come from caloric intake. So step 1. We need to figure out how much of our kilocalories we have for canned food. So the kilocalories per day total for this cat is 250 kilocalories per day. 250, kilocalories per day, and this is total. And we need to subtract the canned amount. We don't know the canned amount. We have to figure that out. Then we need to figure out the percentage here. So in the formula, I have the percent divided by 100. So half of the caloric intake is 50%. Now I did that for the formula because it's not always half. Yes, it's easy to figure out how much is for canned and how much is for dry if it's half. 250 divided in half is 125 for canned, 125 for dry. So that's fairly easy. But if we had a weird number in there, like 75%, it's a little bit different to figure it out. So I'm gonna walk through this then using this formula. If you can do this math in your head, you're welcome to do that. So we have that 50% and it's divided by 100. So remember when we talked about bed mass, we need to do all our operations within brackets first. So 50 divided by 100. And so that's going to give us 50. So, it's going to give us 0.5. 50 divided by 100 is 0.5. So we now have 250 kilocalories per day times 0.5. And that's going to give us 250 times 0.5. Oh, look at that, 125. So it's going to be 125 kilocalories per day of canned. So we've completed our first step. We now know how much kilocalories per day is going to be used by canned food. So now we need to figure out how many kilocalories per day is going to be used by dry food. So this is step 2. So I'm sure you don't need a formula for this, but the formula is total kilocalories per day minus canned kilocalories per day. So our total is 250 kilocalories per day total. Now we're subtracting 125 kilocalories per day of cans. And that's going to give us, well, since it was 50-50, it's 125. But again, this number is going to be different if this was like 25% or 30% or 75%. So 125 kilocalories per day, and that's for dry. So I have my answer for step 2. So now my step 3 is calculate the feeding amounts. So calculating feeding amounts of dry food. Let's do the dry first. So this is step 3, dry. So the kilocalories per day of dry, so that's 125 kilocalories per day dry. And we're gonna divide that by how many kilocalories are in a cup. And we get that from the question. I just rewrote it down here so that we would have it on this side of the paper. So 347 kilocalories per cup for the dry food. So 125 divided by 347, that gives us 0.36. Is 0.36 a feeding amount? No, it isn't. So we need to ask ourselves, what's a measurable feeding amount that's close to this amount that the owner can do? 0.36, pretty darn close to 0.33, wouldn't you say? So I would call this a third of a cup dry. And then we need to figure out step 3 still for our canned food. So figuring out canned food, we need our kilocalories per day. Oh geez, I just mixed these up clearly, of canned. I'm gonna have to fix that. So kilocalories per day of canned. Well, we know that because we calculated it up here. We have 125 kilocalories per day of canned to use. And we can divide that by the amount of kilocalories in a can. So 181 kilocalories per can. So 125 divided by 181 is 0.69. Is 0.69 a feedable amount? No. Can you tell an owner to measure out 0.69 of a can? No, you can't. So with cans, I would stick to these numbers as well. Although personally, I find quarter, half, and 3/4 way easier to cut than 1/3 and 2/3. But in this case, 0.69 is so close to 2/3. I'll probably go with that. So that's an actual feeding amount of 2/3 of a can per day. So our instructions to the owner are going to be feed 2/3 of a can per day plus, where was our dry? 1/3 of a cup dry per day. So if the owner asks you, okay, but I want to feed 2 meals of canned food, how do I calculate that? Well, it's 2/3 divided in half. So if you're feeding 2 meals, so 2/3 divided by 2, that's going to give you 1/3 at each meal. So 1/3 of a can per meal, and then that dry food per day. Okay, so that's how we figure out feeding amounts when we're given 2 different scenarios. So either the owner, the owner has given you the feeding amount that they would like to use for the cans, or the doctor has given you how much of the caloric intake is going to be canned food. Okay. So those are our 2 options. Now in all your questions, you are given calories per day, but I do want to talk to you in clinic. Sometimes you need to calculate the calories per day. So I wanted to show you this sheet so you can be familiar with it. So this is one example. This is from Hills. Let's put on here Hills. So different food companies have different methods of calculating what the caloric intake is for pets. I find this Hills chart is the easiest one to use. So this is the one that I reference. Royal Canin has a really long and convoluted formula that's like, has numbers to the power of 0.67 or something like that. Like it's a complicated formula to work. So I just use the Hills one because it's super easy. So for the Hills one, let's say this cat, I just want to cheat a little bit here. let's say this is a 12-pound cat. Okay, it's 5.5 kilos, this cat in our previous scenario. So if we just knew the weight of the cat and the doctor asked us to calculate feeding amounts, we can consult this chart. So what I'm going to do on this chart is I'm going to look for the animal's weight, 5.5 kilos, 12 pounds, okay? And I'm going to come across to here to the RER. The RER is the resting energy requirement. So that's definition is down here. So that's the energy requirement for a normal animal at rest in a thermoneutral environment and is based on body weight. So that means that that animal isn't doing any exercise, it's not moving, it's not eating or digesting, it's not having to thermoregulate, so either keep itself warm or cool itself off. It's in a neutral environment. How many animals do you know that exist in that neutral environment at rest 100% of the time? None. So what we want to actually calculate is the DER, which is the daily energy requirement. So that represents that resting amount plus all the energy expenditure of the animal. It's going to be based on life stage and activity. So we can look over here and we can see that there's growth and there's maintenance. So if I had a kitten that I was calculating food for, I'm going to use this growing kittens formula. So it would, this is so ridiculous. There's no 12-pound kitten, but it would be 250 times 2.5. So let's do that math. 250 times 2.5. So that cat needs to eat 625 kilocalories per day. I mean, ridiculous. You're never going to see a cat that huge, or a kitten that huge, I mean. But that's like basically how you would do that calculation. So if you have a normal neutered adult, you can use 1.2 times that resting energy requirement, RER. So a normal neutered adult is an animal that has a 5 out of 9 body condition score. They do not need to lose or gain any weight, and they are in good condition, and they are neutered. So they're not having to expend energy on reproduction. So in that case, this cat, if it was a normal and neutered adult, 250 times 1.2. So the caloric amount for that cat would be 300. If we have a intact adult, we would take that 250 and we would times it by 1.4. So it's 350 for an intact adult. If you have an obese-prone animal, which this cat is diabetic, I'm gonna bet it's hefty. An obese-prone animal, we would calculate at 1 times the resting requirement. So the resting requirement of 250 times 1 is 250. And if the doctor instructed me that he'd like to see this cat lose some weight, we could use the weight loss, which is 0.8. So 250 times 0.8 gives us 200 kilocalories. I personally do not like using this one because if they need to be on a weight loss, if they need to be losing weight, they should be in a weight loss program where we're monitoring them really closely. So which we'll talk about when we talk about obesity a little bit later on next week. So I don't typically use this 0.8 calculation very often. I will use obese prone, but if I need weight loss, I'm going to be looking for a weight loss diet typically. And then same idea for canines. We're still going to look at that resting energy requirement. It's based strictly on body weight, but you'll see for dogs, we have a little bit different calculations here. So for dogs that are growing, so puppies, if they are 4 months or less, we're going to multiply that one by 3. If they're older than 4 months, their caloric requirements are starting to slow down, we can multiply the resting, the RER by 2. And then for maintenance, we have an average neutered adult, which is 1.6. An intact adult is 1.8. An obese prone adult is 1.5. And then for weight loss, it's 1. But again, if we're looking at weight loss, I want them on a weight loss program. If we have a dog that is a working dog, we're going to use the working DER calculation. So for light work, that might be a dog, like a therapy dog or a support animal. that I would consider light work, because the dog isn't working its body really hard, although it is working its mind. So I would multiply that by 2 then, the resting rate. Moderate work, maybe like police work. Heavy work would be like sled dogs, where they're just giving her for like 16 hours at a time. You're going to be feeding 4 to 8 times that resting requirement. So that's going to depend on just how heavy that work is. So I wanted to show you one of these calorie charts so that you have an example and know how to work them. Now, the good news for you guys is you've learned all this math. You are going to practice it and you're going to get amazing at it, and I'm going to be so proud of you. And then I'm going to send you guys off to your practicums, and you're going to work in clinics, and you're going to realize real quick that most of these food companies that sell food at your vet clinic have computer programs that do the calculations for you. So you might not have to do very much active math work for calculating feeding amounts. So if you work with Royal Canin or for Hills, they do have like computer programs or programs through the internet that you can access that will do the calculations for the calorie amounts that they get per day, and it'll figure out what the feeding amounts are. It'll even calculate cost per cup, cost per day, so you can share those things with owners. So those are tools that those food companies offer you so that you can do your job faster and more efficient. I mean, we've seen between these 3 lectures, I think it's an hour and a half, right? That's a lot. I mean, I've been talking too when explaining it. It's not like I'm just sitting and doing math that takes me a half an hour per problem, but you can see that it does take extra time to sit and do the math. If you can just plug in the animal's weight and body condition score and it does the rest for you, that's kind of a beautiful thing. It's pretty fast and efficient. That being said though, those computer programs don't always work. And sometimes they are wildly wrong. When Royal Canin first introduced theirs, there was like a glitch in their formulas, and they were recommending like way low feeding amounts. I was like, that just doesn't seem right. So I did the math myself, and I was like, yeah, no, that's not right. And then we had to contact the company, and they ended up having to pull the program and restart it all over again. So it is a good idea to know how to do this math, because even if you have computer programs to do it for you, computer programs aren't perfect. They're written by humans who make mistakes. So you might need to catch those mistakes. Also, not all the companies have that program. So anytime, like I'm fairly certain, last I checked anyway, Purina does not have a program like that. So you need to calculate feeding amounts manually for Purina diets. And as well, sometimes a doctor asks you to calculate feeding amounts for a food that isn't sold through your practice. So I've had that very rarely, where an owner is feeding a pet store diet and they have the kilocalories per cup, and they want to know how much to feed. So in that case, you might have to do the calculation for them manually, because you know those pet food brands or pet store brands aren't going to have a program for you to do that. Okay, so I hope that explains well for you how to do these calculating feeding amount questions. So now, my task for you, I'm sending you back to your practice sheet to go ahead and practice these kind of scenarios and work out feeding amounts for the animals. If you do have any questions after going through all this math, by all means, please ask. I'm so happy to explain any of it to you. If you're confused about anything, I'm happy to open up a virtual classroom. We can do it one-on-one. I can walk you through it all together, okay? So if you feel like at all you need help on this, I'm so happy to help you, okay? So please do reach out if you're not getting it. That being said, thank you so much for listening to these math lectures today. Ask me if you have some questions, and we'll see you in the virtual classroom. Thank you.